So good evening and welcome to this evening's Melbourne Conversations, Climate Change Impact, Paris Ambitions, Melbourne Actions, brought to you by City of Melbourne. I respectfully acknowledge the land of the Kulin Nation, the land on which we meet here today, pay my respects to their elders past and present. My name is Aaron Wood and I'll be your MC for this evening, but I'm also a councillor for the City of Melbourne and I'm the chair of the Environment Portfolio. Before we get underway, I'd like to screen a short video recorded especially for us by Mark Watts. He's the Executive Director of the London-based Secretariat of C40. Melbourne is a member of C40, a leadership group of the world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. The video.
Congratulations Melbourne and Mayor Doyle for being one of the first 10 cities in the world to be fully compliant with the Compact of Mayors ahead of Paris. The Compact of Mayors is an opportunity for city leaders to record their emissions inventories, targets and action plans ahead of the critical climate talks in Paris and provide transparency for the great ambition that cities are showing in trying to tackle climate change. So why does it matter what cities do in tackling climate change? Well, the simple answer is, from some research that C40 published very recently, that a third of the remaining safe carbon budget, the total amount of carbon emissions that we can risk putting up in the atmosphere and avoid catastrophic climate change, a third of that budget will be determined by decisions made by mayors in cities around the world in the next 5 years. So what you're discussing today in Melbourne is critical to the whole of the world being able to tackle climate change. And the fact that cities are so critical to tackling climate change is actually a reason for optimism. Because whilst the last big climate talks in Copenhagen in 2009 were a disappointment and undoubtedly set back action, in that period since Copenhagen, cities in C40 have massively ramped up action rather than sitting back. So we've seen a total of 10,000 individual climate actions taken across our member cities. And now tremendous new ambition that ranges from Vancouver's plan for 100% renewable energy, Stockholm experimenting with new technology that will allow them to generate energy from garden waste. And of course there's Melbourne's own incredibly impressive energy efficiency and renewable energy project for residential buildings. But the one thing that unites all of these different examples that I've given is the fact that cities in C40 are not just going it alone, they're collaborating with each other so that good ideas will get replicated all across the world, massively increasing our ability to cut emissions and move towards a low carbon world.
Thank you to Mark Watts. A round of applause for his introduction. So a little bit of context. The Paris Climate Change Convention, or COP21 as it's much more easily known, is soon to begin and the stakes are very high. Cities contribute 80% of global greenhouse emissions and as a result are at the forefront of managing the impacts of climate change but also addressing the mitigation. So what does this all mean for Melbourne? Perhaps the first point to emphasise is that Melbourne is internationally recognised for its leadership in sustainability. Councillor Cathy Oak will tell you more about global networks at the core of this Paris meeting. But in a parallel gathering, local government representatives will meet to discuss city commitments. As you heard from Mark Watts, the City of Melbourne is a signatory to the Compact of Mayors. This coalition of city officials pledges to reduce local greenhouse gas emissions and track progress transparently. I'll be going to Paris to represent the City of Melbourne and the C40 actions that we are undertaking as well. I hope to convey to our global counterparts at the City of Melbourne as we take the eco-city very seriously. It's much more than just a phrase, it's really about a goal. It's about how we see our city. It's about the sort of action that we undertake as a city. But it's also about how we as a community respond and how we as a local government provide a voice to that community as well. So, a few of you need to be reminded of the challenges that we face, of the huge issue that is climate change, or of the breadth of action that's required. But again, local governments are absolutely at the forefront of these challenges. In terms of how the City of Melbourne has responded to these challenges, is in some ways we've responded to them quite practically And some would say in quite a simple way, yet the research behind many of these actions is hugely significant. We've set a target to become a carbon neutral city as a municipality. We are carbon neutral certified ourselves, but in terms of actually reaching that goal of a carbon neutral municipality, we're less than 1% of the emissions across our city. So we can't do this without all our partners, without our businesses, without our local community, without our education institutions, certainly without our residents, and all of those working hand in hand together to achieve these pretty tough targets. Our zero net emissions by 2020 is a really ambitious one. We've got a target of 25% of our renewable energy being from renewable sources by 2018, which is also a big stretch target that we hope to meet as well. Our urban forest and open space strategies have been lauded all around the world, and our target of planting 3,000 trees a year, we're on track for that. And in fact, we've planted 12,000 trees in the last 4 years, with our target of doubling the forest canopy cover over the next 20 years to 2040. We know that the benefits of this are manifold, that it's not just about making our city look good, it's about cooling the city, meeting the urban heat island effect, flood mitigation, and so many other co-benefits that green infrastructure provides. We know that these threats are serious. When you look at the inner city of Melbourne, it's up to 4 to 7 degrees hotter than surrounding green areas. We know that the urban forest strategy, the research underpinning that if we follow that strategy as we have been over the last 4 years, that we can cool the city by about 4 degrees. This has, again, huge amenity impacts into the city, but lesser known is the impact of heat on health. And when you look at the horrific Black Saturday bushfires, we lost over 170 lives in those bushfires. Huge impact. And if you draw your mind back to that week leading up to those bushfires, the heat was absolutely stifling. What's lesser known is that in that heat wave leading up to those Black Saturday bushfires, we actually lost over 370 lives due to heat-related stress and illness. So this is not just about the environment, it's not just about well-being, it's not just about the amenity of our city, it has a huge health and economic impact as well. So we know that a city that is good for the environment is also good for people. A city where people cycle, where people walk, is also good for personal health. So this isn't a decision between the environment and the economy or well-being. It's essentially a target to bring about a better society into the future. The City of Melbourne works with many partners in industry, the community, other tiers of government, and of course the speakers will reveal not just in this city but also all around the globe. Further, we live in a truly connected global world. What happens internationally at events like COP21 really filters right throughout the global community. So these events are hugely significant to nations, to states, and also, as you'll find, to cities. We're intent on showing that an eco-city and taking bolder action on climate change makes good economic, social and environmental sense. So I'm now going to ask our panellists to join me on stage with that scene setting. Our first panellist to join me on stage is Rowan Dowland. He's the General Manager of Corporate Development for Bank Australia. This bank has joined a growing number of businesses around the world making significant commitments to address climate change. It's the first bank in the world to commit to all 7 climate commitments under the We Mean Business Commitment to Action Climate Leadership Platform, and it joins Origin Energy, which was the first to sign on to all 7 commitments. A round of applause for Rowan. Thank you. Our next panellist probably needs no introduction. He has had a huge environmental career, will be very well known to many of you. He is Professor Don Henry. He's the Public Policy Fellow for Environmentalism at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. He's very experienced in this realm and most recently was the CEO of the Australian Conservation Foundation. He's also an international board member of Al Gore's Climate Reality Project and has attended more than 10 global COP meetings. A round of applause for Don Henry. Stephanie Nile is here in her capacity as a community member. She has considerable experience as a consultant and attended the Bali and Copenhagen COPs. She's a member of the City of Yarra Environment Advisory Committee. She's completing a PhD through the Law School of the University of Melbourne, and her work explores the concept of resilience as a primary policy or legal objective in relation to climate change. A round of applause for Stephanie. And our last panellist to join us on stage is a colleague of mine and has been for many years. She is hugely active in the environmental space. That is Councillor Cathy Oak. She's the Chair of the Transport Committee, Deputy Chair of the Environment Committee. She's also Chair of the ICLEI Oceania Regional Executive Committee and member of its Global Executive Committee. ICLEI, or Local Governments for Sustainability, is the world's leading association of cities and local governments dedicated to sustainable development and is the contact point for cities for COP21. She's represented cities at many of the previous COPs as well. So a round of applause for Cathy and all our panellists. So what we're going to do, as I said, is we're going to have a bit of a chat, and given that this is called Melbourne Conversations, we hope that this turns into a conversation. But I am going to start with you, Don. With all your experience at previous COPs, it's an extensive list of attendance at these COPs. What is, and I know this is not an easy question to answer, but what's most likely to be agreed at Paris in the upcoming COP? Just an easy one to start off with.
Piece of cake. Aaron, thanks very much, and colleagues and friends in the audience. I just want to make one point first, because the question could be, what should we watch here and take away from it? And I'd suggest two things, and this is particularly relevant to cities. We want to watch what actually goes on in the agreement-making process, and that's an attempt to get a global agreement by consensus with 195 countries there, and the significance of this is to be the first time that a global agreement is attempted to be struck that has emission commitments of all the countries. But that's only half of it. So the other half is the political momentum, the public attention provides a real opportunity for other agreements to happen, for things around this international agreement making to really get momentum. It's highly relevant to cities, and I'm sure we'll discuss that. So I wanted to make that point. What might come out of the actual agreement making process? Well, if anyone's interested, if you want to read a 50-page draft agreement, go in on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change website, the UNFCCC website. So there is a draft agreement that's got about half of it already bracketed. And then the other thing that's happened is, I think partly encouragingly, we've got almost 150 of those 195 countries have put forward commitments into this agreement-making process. There's the good news. So that gives you a sense of what could come out of this. That gives you a sense there's considerable momentum to actually land an agreement. And it's quite important here that the US and China are driving very hard for it to land. There's the good news. Here's the really big challenge. A week and a half ago, the Secretariat for the Convention did a formal analysis of what do these commitments all add up to, the commitments that are on the table. Are we on track to keep warming at least below 2 degrees, which is accepted as a dangerous limit? Many would argue it should be 1.5. Here's the challenge. The commitments on the table at the moment, at best, have only got us on track for about 2.7. So they take us way over. So one thing to watch is there is considerable momentum for an agreement to land. It's still challenging. Got to get 195 countries signed on. The other thing to watch is it's likely to be very modest with really big gaps in it, and it'll provide the challenge of how do we take additional action to fill those gaps And how do we put more momentum in behind those countries that have got weak commitments on the table? And by the way, that includes Australia. Our commitment on the table is really weak.
Don, before I go to Kathy, talking about the city voice, how likely, given that 2.7 degree commitment, I mean, there's a sort of line in the sand, if you like, how likely is that sort of number to move during a COP, or do the deals have to be done before the COP?
Fundamentally, the deals have to be done before the COP. So it'll be highly unusual for that 2.7 figure to shift, unfortunately, unless, I mean, for instance, here in Australia, where we've got a very weak commitment on the table, it's much weaker comparatively than the US, for example, arguably weaker than China's. If we together, in all our roles in Australian civil society, can build up pressure on the Australian government to improve that commitment in Paris, yes, it could be improved. But another crucial thing to watch at Paris is if we get a modest agreement with gaps in it, it's going to be very important how often will this be reviewed. And there's a huge debate in Paris whether the review cycle should be 10 years or 5 years. With what we're seeing likely to emerge as very modest, it's very, very important that the review cycles are 5 years so one can rapidly ratchet up the ambition over time.
Thank you for that. Kathy, I'll come to you because I think the city voice is really key, and I mean, that's what we're here talking about this evening. Having been to Copenhagen and been part of that in previous COPs, what, I guess, you know, largely if you're an outsider, you see it's a negotiation between nations. What sort of voice do cities have, and how can we have a bigger voice, I guess, is the question.
It's a good question. I was busy writing down more questions for Don. It's quite funny because there is, it's a very technical process that actually happens in Copenhagen, and I was noting that you already started using UN text, like bracketed text, and COP, you know, Conference of Parties.
These are sort of the TING
yeah,
acronyms.
That's right, you know, put your hand, we need a bell for all of the UN acronyms, but it is a very complicated process, and there are lots of parallel events going on by very many groups out there, but the one that I've quite obviously been interested in is cities, and a few acronyms, I think this is working, a few acronyms have been mentioned tonight, or not only C40, but also ICLEI. There's another one to throw into the mix, UCLG, which is, I think, United Cities and Local Government. These are three of the main, but there are many more local government and regional associations around the world, where hundreds, probably thousands of cities have made commitments to be, you know, to work towards or to be as sustainable as possible. And I guess since Bali in 2007, I think that was COP13, these Conference of Parties do happen every year. At the Bali event, these organisations came together and effectively said, we want a post-Kyoto agreement, a post-2012 agreement to be global, strong, ambitious, achievable, and to do so we will map out a roadmap. So it's called the Local Government Roadmap. Don't we all love that term as well? But it is, as it is, it's called the Local Government Roadmap. So in terms of cities having a voice in Paris, there's been a lot of work that has gone on since 2007 every year, and the work is focused in many directions. One is obviously trying to get our own cities around the world, be that small, large, mega, developed, to make commitments and make actions around climate change. Make sure that those actions are transparent, are accountable, are measurable. And so a lot of work has gone around making that possible through all of these cities working together. Then there's actually working within our own countries in trying to work with our states and our national governments to actually make commitments. And there was certainly a big period of time when, and there still is, I guess, where cities are being way more ambitious than our nations. And there were, in Australia alone, through the ICLES CCP program, another acronym, Cities for Climate Protection program, I understand at the time, of the 220 cities across Australia that had signed up to this program, they were making way more commitments collectively to reduce our carbon footprint than our current government at the time was. So, and the same thing was happening in the US. The US mayors were making significant contributions to reductions in carbon footprints in their cities, and again, much more ambitious than their national government. So there's that work going on. In the actual technical part of the UN process, there's a lot of negotiations going on with the groups from each of the countries that come and negotiate to try and bring consensus. And it's not just about the ambitious targets, it's also about the technical, how is it going to work, the finance agreements, how are we going to actually make this...
How do those negotiations happen? Like, is there a lot of sort of paper passing and backroom meetings before this gets taken into the formal process?
And during the process as well, and you don't know who you're going to meet. I mean, from a non-state actor or a civil society group, if you're not part of the actual nations doing the negotiations around, if you're a part of a non-state actor or civil society, you take the meetings as you can and you're negotiating on the particular parts of the text that you're most interested in. The part that cities have been most interested in for a long time, and we did have a huge win in Mexico in 2010, and then also in 2013, where cities and local government, cities and subnational governments, so states, were not recognised as a level of government. So in the UN, we were part of civil society, and granted, I like that as a city. We are part of civil society, we are closest to the people, but we are actually a level of government, but we weren't recognised as such. And in the text, it was very important for us to be recognised as a player, as a partner in meeting climate action targets. So the boring sort of the meetings, get the nations around a table and you get whichever mayors were in town at the time, whichever, councillors, mayors, leading city officials at the time to work on their nations, to agree within the text in the brackets to insert, to support cities. So I know that I've been going on for a long time and we need to move on.
I think
but importantly, the current text that Don has referred to that's on the website at the moment, importantly and very excitedly for cities, and I know it might not be for everyone, but for cities, it's in there, and no nation has cities and non-state actors have been formally recognised in the text as key partners in meeting our ambitions for climate change across the world.
So we've got a gig.
We've
got a gig. So Mike Bloomberg, who many of you would know, heads up that great organisation of C40. He talked about, and Don, we love this statement about nations talking and cities acting. So I think it's really good that cities are at the table. He's been a little bit more diplomatic in recent times and said that cities can be very, very helpful in helping nations meet their targets. Stephanie, you've been to previous COPs, but I want to talk about the action that happens at a community level. What can local communities, achieve when we're talking about a huge issue like climate change, and indeed how do sort of people in this room at a community level have any impact, on this huge negotiation?
Well, a number of ways. First of all, they can elect people like you to actually go and drive action.
I like that one.
There we go, just playing to my audience. But the other key thing, one of the things sort of that you noticed in Copenhagen, it was sort of a victim of its own success. I will get back to communities. And so you had civil society in amongst all the delegates, and it got unwieldy, it got crazy, and there were some real security risks, particularly when all the big heads of state started arriving. So civil society were basically dismissed from the entire convention centre. And that left this awful void. It left a vacuum. You were wandering around this massive space and it was empty, and you were negotiating on these texts. And you sort of lost sense of reality in a way, because there was no sort of touch point, and you were doing ridiculously long hours under these artificial lights. And it was very hard to sort of keep in mind what you were actually there for and what you were trying to achieve. And I was sort of reflecting on this issue today, and one of the things I thought that has changed a lot since Copenhagen is the fact that even if civil society are expelled again from the primary sort of negotiating space, we now have social media, we now got Twitter, we've got a way for civil society to reinsert themselves, even if officially they are kind of removed. And so I think someone had already said that. I think getting that momentum up and getting that sort of that global voice to remind the delegates of really what they're trying to achieve and the fact that they are representing the billions of people around the planet is a really, really, really sort of vital step to it. And in terms of local action, to me, coming out of Copenhagen was really it was a really sobering experience, to put it mildly. There was so much build-up and then to just see it all fall apart. And I sort of came out of that thinking that, you know, there is no space for the international community. You know, this whole sort of process is flawed. What we need to do is go back to grassroots and, you know, the sum of the international agreement cannot be bigger than all its individual parts. And I sort of felt at that point in time that the political will wasn't there to drive an ambitious agreement. And political will is made up of how much we are pressuring our individual leaders. So that's when it comes back to the community level and the fact that we cannot rely on this international agreement to force action locally. It's actually a very complex relationship, but a key part of that is making sure that people are on the street, making sure you're sort of on social media, you're making your presence felt, you let the rest of the world know that even though there may not be the ambitious target at the national level, that the Australian people are there and they're willing to act and they're willing to sort of put themselves out there. So I think that to me is sort of one of the really key roles that the average citizen can play in this sort of international process. And even though you're only one of billions, it still is a really important role and everyone needs to take it seriously to get that message through.
So I'm supposed to be an impartial moderator here, Stephanie, but I was about to sort of jump to my feet and cheer because I think, you know, too often we sort of put that emphasis on the international agreement and, you know, the complexities that Don and Kathy have spoken about, you know, for a complex international agreement like that to succeed is a very, very difficult thing. But this is just another step along the way, if you like, and there's been many steps along the way and there'll be many more, and you know, keeping that voice and making sure that we've got that sense of reality with where those negotiations fit in things is a really good message. Rowan, I guess you know, one of the things with small business is, you know, kind of struggling with this this mix of you know, national policy and regulation and best practice and, you know, corporate social responsibility. You know, Bank Australia is a relatively small to medium-sized bank. How does an organisation of that scale play a role, and what sort of things are you envisaging in that sector to give it a voice?
Sure, and listening to you, and I'm sure you will agree, there's such complexity around this process. Don, you said we all have different roles to play, and I think we very clearly see that we have a role to play in terms of trying to provide some sense of clarity around some of this complexity and to bring some of these issues that might otherwise feel quite remote more close to the customers who bank with our bank. We are a very small bank, about $4 billion in assets. A small bank, I guess, with a very large name, and we've taken some very strong positions on climate over the last decade. The bank became carbon neutral in 2010. We were the first provider of motor vehicle finance in the world that provided an environmental overlay to its motor vehicle finance, and the first...
No VWs need apply.
No VWs, no.
Excellent.
First provider of finance in the world that offset the loss of biodiversity on its new home construction. Now, these are all examples of trying to bring clarity to what could otherwise be a very, very complex issue around climate change. I think small banks have a really important role to play, and particularly small customer-owned banks. I was saying to Don before the session, we're in the business of banking, but banking is not why we're in business. Our business is in the business of creating mutual prosperity. What that means is we're trying to create wealth on behalf of the customers who own our bank, but in a way that also builds more resilient communities and contributes to a healthy planet. And what we needed to do in this very complex lead up, I think, to COP21 is try and find the ways that we could engage with, connect this complex issue to people here in Melbourne. And so the management decided to do was to take forward a recommendation to the board in October to sign on to all 7 carbon disclosure, CPD, we mean business, action on climate change commitments, which is a process of businesses making commitments around the world in the lead up to COP21. We were actually surprised when we were putting the recommendation together that we were, in fact, if we signed on to all 7 commitments, we would be the first bank in the world to do that. So here's this small bank in Melbourne. Thank you.
Thank you, audience.
I want to just, because I think sometimes people cloud or get confused around size. Can smaller businesses make a big difference, or is it the larger businesses that make a big difference? And I'm not sure that it's size that makes the difference. I think it's actually clarity around purpose and a real sense of clarity around how businesses create value. So can I take a minute or two, just to take you through the process of the discussion that took place inside our bank that enabled us to reach agreement on signing on to all 7 CPD, we mean business commitments. Management takes that recommendation into the board, and as part of that recommendation and discussion with the board, and some of you may be customers, you may have some insights into the very commercially savvy board that we have. If not, Google it after the meeting. So we take a recommendation into the board. We say that we're going to be the first bank in the world to sign on to all 7 CBD commitments. You've probably got a sense the first thing the bank directors think about and ask themselves the question, why hasn't anybody else done that? What's the risks to this bank of signing on to 7 commitments and being the first bank to do so in the world, still the only bank to do so in the world? Why haven't the other banks done that? I'm going to give you a sense of the size of I've just note some numbers down before I came here tonight. It's 260 companies and 144 investors that have signed on to the CBD commitments. Not a large number, but let me give you some large numbers. That represents $5.8 trillion in revenue and $19.5 trillion in assets. Those very large businesses have made a total of only 661 commitments. Now, I'm a banker, so I can kind of get out my calculator and work out that only averages at 1.68 commitments per signatory. And these are very, very large businesses, and here's this very, very small bank making a commitment to all 7. So the board has a whole range of discussions around the risks, the costs, why we would do this, and then it comes to making a decision, and the decision was unanimous to sign on to 7 commitments and be the only bank in the world to do that. Why? Because it wasn't scale, wasn't size, wasn't large or small. It was this small bank based in Melbourne had clarity of purpose. We don't exist for the purpose of maximising profits, we exist for the purpose of creating mutual prosperity. And by signing on to these commitments, we honour the commitment that we give the customers who own the bank to invest their money responsibly and to do so in a way that builds strong communities and contributes to a healthy planet. That's... Thank you. That's our way of connecting this complexity in a very practical way here in Melbourne in the lead up to Paris. Yeah.
Very well said. Don, Stephanie mentioned civil society, and Kathy was talking about sort of all these acronyms and sort of definitions and text in brackets, and I think, you know, for me, you know, looking down attending my first COP, just not knowing what to expect at all. But you know, what is civil society? I think we've all probably got a definition in our heads. What does it mean at COP, and do they play a significant role? What sort of role do they play?
Well, look, a really important role, but let me mention it in 2 parts. So the most important part, I mean, we're civil society in this room. So civil society is, you know, everybody in our society, not in a for-profit or government role. So we are all sitting in this room as civil society. It means citizens. The crucial, you probably picked up from our discussion earlier, these international agreements, they sound really complex, but what it is 195 countries coming to a table to make agreements. Now, where we as Australians have got our crucial role is what our country, Australia, does. And civil society in the US or in China or in Europe have an opportunity to influence what their own governments do. And at the end of the day, these complicated agreement processes just come down to governments. And those governments are there representing us. So at one level, we have a crucial role to play before Paris, because our government will be making decisions at a cabinet level as to what positions Australia takes into Paris and what sort of flexibility we have with those positions. There's two crucial elements: how ambitious we are with our cuts in emissions and how generous and fair we're going to be to support the effort that disadvantaged or affected countries.
That's dollars, Don, money on the table.
So it's money on the table to help, and it's what we're prepared to do to walk the talk to cut our emissions. It's pretty simple. There's two things. Those two things have to happen. And for civil society, our fundamental role as Australians is our influence on what our government is prepared to do, to take into Paris, and then what it does. That's the most important thing, Aaron. The second thing is, at the meeting itself, civil society does play a very important role. So, you know, the major Australian environment groups will be there, the major Australian development groups will be there, representing their broad memberships. And, for instance, they'll be meeting every day with the Australian delegation. They'll meet with the Australian Foreign Affairs Minister. They might be able to get in with the Prime Minister, and they'll be putting strong views forward on what Australia should be. And there's a rich tapestry of civil society groups all around the world focused on their own governments and trying to shift their governments. So one message I want to give here, it does sound complex, but you can make it quite simple. It's, let me give you a suggestion if I may. I wonder how many of our representatives at the federal level have had someone phone or knock on their door wanting to sit down and say, I want to talk to you about the position that Australia's taking into Paris. I bet you they've had hardly anyone. And if half of the people in this room did that, you'd probably change the message coming into federal cabinet. Gee, Australians are starting to focus on what we're going to do at Paris.
Can we check that,
so there's a suggestion of impact.
Hands up, anyone who's either contacted or written to their local member about strong climate action recently. Got a few in the room, and I guess this is a pretty engaged audience. So after we finish Melbourne Conversations tonight, we'll be standing out the front. Everyone get on their phones, and we'll just make a quick call to our local member.
But Don, not everyone is lobbying for a strong commitment.
So
Segue?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
We're talking about the forces of good, if you like. There's a fairly strong and active lobby that is very well resourced. You know, what is, if you're wanting strong climate action, what are the people that are wanting strong climate action up against in the form of those lobby groups?
Well, if you look at, let me bring it home for us as well, if you look at the Australian target, it's an interim target that's currently on the table in Paris. I think it's fair to say that Australian businesses that are the heavy polluters have had a very strong hand in what that target looks like. So we've got a very weak target on the table. It's a target that's very friendly to a very gentle decline in Australia's emissions. And so that tussle we have at home, the tussle between the voices who want strong action and those that have a vested interest in not having strong action, that's playing out now, and that will play out every day in the run into Paris, and it will play out every day during Paris.
So can I, sorry, I'll come to you both on this, both to Kathy and Stephanie. See if you can weave into this as well, because I'm happy for you to reflect on Don's comments about that, because I think it's a really important point to open people's eyes that, you know, when people sort of say, well, why isn't this happening? Sometimes there's very good reasons why it isn't happening. But sort of adding on to that, you know, playing the devil's advocate a little bit is, you know, looking at previous COPs and certainly Copenhagen. Why is Paris important? Why should we even care? Kathy?
You start. You go.
Okay. To me, Paris is fundamentally important because, to me, it's an exercise of rebuilding trust that was otherwise broken through the Copenhagen process. And we're not going to really get any movement on any front here unless we sort of break down that, or build up that trust deficit, particularly between the developed and the developing countries. The fear that countries have about putting themselves too far out there and sort of being the only one sort of left alone. And so, to me, the whole process, and this is sort of how I've defined success in my head of Paris, it's not necessarily, I mean, obviously the emissions reductions are critically important and we want them to be as strong as possible, but if we've got a mechanism to ramp that up over time, then the emphasis can be a little bit less on exactly what those emissions reductions are and more on the process around building trust, about those other elements that Don already mentioned, about ensuring that the developed countries know that we're going to have the technology transfer there, ensuring that the other kinds of support, that the countries actually commit money to the Green Climate Fund, which is going to be the primary mechanism that this agreement produces to actually support those countries who need more support in this space across adaptation and mitigation. And so to me, that element of trust becomes even more important. And there are many different ways that plays out. And I think that the presence of state government, local government, civil society is all going to really contribute to that feeling of trust and to that generation of trust, because the trust doesn't necessarily just have to happen at that nation-state level. Through building these commitments at the city level, through building more connections at the local level, through having all the environmental groups have a focal point where they can come together, share ideas, create that common sense of purpose. That to me is also one of the really, really sort of big important things that's coming out of this COP. And yeah, sort of telling those stories, creating that sense of common purpose and that sort of sense of shared responsibility, rebuilding that trust that has been so broken in the system, even before Copenhagen, but particularly after Copenhagen.
Kathy?
Well, I'm glad you went first, only because it is a good segue to what I wanted to say. Like, why is Melbourne going, and why is the city of Melbourne, you know, our municipality, spending money for us to travel, and why am I, or both of us, taking time off our day jobs and taking annual leave and, you know, going, why is it so important for us to be represented there? And one part of what you just said was that the climate finance and the technology transfer and the capacity building that are also part of the agreement, the negotiations. It's so important to cities, and it might not be as essential it is essential that we have a great agreement for Australia and for Australian cities, don't get me wrong, but the City of Melbourne, we have money. We had, you know, enough money to at least put good, solid technology, infrastructure, policy around climate adaptation and mitigation, but a lot of cities don't. And a lot of cities do need the finance to be on the table, to be not only at the nation level, but it needs to be at the city level. And I think it is actually a responsibility of cities like Melbourne and London and Auckland and Sydney and, you know, the mega cities of the world to put the money on the table to travel and spend the time negotiating and advocating and presenting the case of cities. Not because Australia or not because the City of Melbourne wants access to the Green Finance Fund. It's not because we're going to get money that way, but cities that we work with in countries that don't have access to money like we do, they need the support. And so it is really important that if we're going to be a climate leader, and we are, that we are also advocating on behalf of cities that are not as well-resourced as we are. We can come to it, you know, the question as to the importance of a strong commitment to our goals, and that might come later in the discussion, but in terms of the role of Melbourne being in Paris, it's incredibly important that we stand up and actually, make a difference for cities that aren't like ours.
Rowan, you know, you talk about your own corporation's commitments and the good work that you're doing, and I guess the leading example you're setting your sector. How are you feeling about the corporate sector as a whole in terms of its commitment, and is there sort of any good news in that space which will give us hope for Paris? And Don, you'd probably add to this as well.
And hope's a good word, Aaron, because I think what needs to come out of Paris is not only trust but confidence. And from a business perspective, a business likes to be confident in the regulatory legislative settings in which it operates. So if a sense of clarity, again we're talking clarity, comes out of Paris that gives business confidence to invest, I think that's a very positive outcome. I get a sense that things are turning anyway. I get a sense that the challenges that we may have seen post-Copenhagen and the enormous amount of work, Don, you've spoken about some of that, that's been completed in the lead up to Paris, has shifted sentiment in business. My focus is clearly on businesses that are investing for a more sustainable future than those that are not. And I guess the way that I look at it, many businesses exist for the purpose of maximising shareholder value. Historically, they've done that. If we kind of go through history, historically, business has done that through manufacturing. Historically, manufacturing shifted into services, so businesses are creating shareholder value through services. And I think the new horizon that enlightened business, enlightened industry will move to, and is already moving to around the world, is that businesses will create shareholder value by tackling the need for the climate, for the planet to be more sustainable. So it will transition from manufacturing into services into sustainability, and it's in that sustainability space that businesses will eventually understand lies the opportunity to create shareholder value. I think many of you would recognise that probably the greatest business opportunity that exists in the history of mankind is the decarbonisation of the planet. And what we do need to, I think, in terms of business is that confidence in terms of legislative setting. We need confidence in the business cases around investing in a sustainable future. We probably need leaders who can articulate very clearly the business case for investing in sustainable development. I think if we can achieve that, if that's an outcome post-Paris as a consequence of confidence being built in Paris, that'd be fabulous.
Don, you've been part of and facilitated some recent announcements from some pretty large brands around their commitments. Give us some tangible examples of GE, for example, not exactly, a greeny sort of movement, but now earning sort of, I think, in the order of $15 or $16 billion from their clean energy side of their business. So they're getting this transitions going on. What are some of the other big brands that you're working with?
Great question. And I want to pick up what Rowan said first. I mean, we need great leadership from progressive businesses. They'll be leading the way. And, by the way, we've probably all got superannuation in this room or investments. And so don't forget our own role in what happens in our name with our own money and the influence we can all have on businesses in Australia. We're part of that. But I think this is also, even though Paris is looking very modest, here's another benefit. There was very good science done in the run-up to Paris, and there was a release of a new iteration of what's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But in essence, it's a grouping of 2,000 plus of the world's best climate scientists who review what's already out there in the peer-reviewed literature. And these reports are updated every 5 years, and the finalised update was delivered in March this year. But it had a new dimension to it, and this was a clearer understanding of the carbon budgets, and that was mentioned in the video. We've got a straight chemistry thing here where CO2, the major driver of climate change, its half-life in the atmosphere, I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong, it's probably about 100 years, and some of it lasts a long, long time, so you can't sort of turn it on and off straight away. And the scientists said that, look, there's a limit of how much more we can put in the atmosphere and stay below 2 degrees, because it doesn't wash out of the sky with the next shower of rain. It's up there for a long time. And that realisation of the carbon budget has then led to clearer thinking that, for example, the group of industrialised countries earlier this year, the G7, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor who hosted that meeting, they formed the view and announced that the global economy has to be decarbonised this century. Now, many would say it has to be by mid-century, but that's a big step for the big industrialised countries. Now, here's what's important. We've just recently seen a group of Australia's big emitting businesses, and this includes BHP Billiton, Wesfarmers, AGL. We've seen the CEOs release a statement saying that a strong Paris outcome is needed, that it needs to put the world on track to below 2 degrees, and they noted the work of the science community that says we have to decarbonise sometime this century. Now, that's a major shift by those companies. I'm encouraged by that. They now need to put those words better into action in their own businesses, and they now need to put those words better into action with their own political influence of our governments. But we can encourage them, by the way.
So can I just add a small point to that? Linked to that, and this was an incredible step too. One of the early drafts of the negotiating text, so this was an 85-page draft of preliminary draft full of these square brackets that we've been talking about, which indicate that text has not been settled. And yes, it was in square brackets, but in that negotiating text, someone had actually put in a statement about the need to decarbonise, fully decarbonise by 2050, I think it was. And to me, the very fact that that appeared in the text, that it got to the point that even though it was bracketed, it was there, represented a massive shift as well.
So how solid are those brackets? Because we sort of just smudge them out or something like that. Look, I mean, one of the things too, I think, as when you sort of put your general community hat on, because we're all community members as well, and you sort of see the hottest on record, the driest, the longest heat wave, tornadoes above Melbourne Airport, all of these sort of warning signs just get, forever more piercing. There's a sense of, I guess, growing frustration, but I think for every point of frustration, there's also an amazing amount of good news happening, and even in the negotiations themselves, and even previous COPs where people thought were failures, there was still big things done and that have been building towards this. I want to bring that right back now before we open up to the audience for questions. And we'll start with you, Kathy, and just work our way along. Give us some really practical examples of what is being done. I'm talking projects and actual, initiatives that are being done. What's the City of Melbourne? I feel funny asking this. What's the City of Melbourne doing about tackling climate change? Given that you've been a councillor now, this is your second term.
I thought you presented it so well at the start. It's quite funny. I was at the Sustainable Development Goal presentation a couple of weeks ago, and the chair introduced me as the director of the Environment Department, which was quite good. Sorry, Ian, Kate, but I'm not. But I have been very lucky to be involved in some significant programs at the City of Melbourne, which was started, before I arrived. But becoming a zero net emission city is no small feat when you haven't got your levers, the hands on all the levers, when we don't control the brown coal that is feeding our electricity. How do we get around that? We don't want to say, yeah, we're going to be zero net emission, carbon neutral, and just pay offsets. Like, that is not what we want to do, and I really do credit the amazing people that work at the City of Melbourne in the sustainability team for going, no, we don't want to do that. Let's work our way around that. And Aaron and the sustainability team have been really innovative in their large-scale renewable programs, and also how we work with our building stock within the City of Melbourne. And you've probably heard about it before, but where our old buildings in the City of Melbourne are one of the biggest contributors to our footprint. and through fairly innovative finance, we found a way where the occupiers of the apartments and the businesses can receive the benefit through reduced energy bills and water bills by retrofitting the places that they live. They will receive the benefits, but they don't necessarily own the whole building, and so we've found a way of helping them receive finance and helping them to pay back. So it's a very innovative, it's very complex as well, but it's finding ways around the barriers that we have to becoming carbon neutral, which I think is where we're leading. Not only is it around policy, legislative, thinking outside the box, getting large-scale renewable. There's some, and obviously the urban forest strategy, which is world leading as well, thinking about the way that we green our city and the multiple benefits that it provides. And these are the projects that are happening in cities all across the world.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. It's sort of finding each of those pressure points, if you like, and then designing a program to fulfil that need. And I think cities and indeed communities have been very good at kind of going, even in the absence potentially, previously of strong national leadership, it's okay. If you're not going to do it, we're going to find a way to do that. And whether that's incentivising, rooftop solar or energy efficiency programs or building upgrades, as you mentioned. Stephanie, what are one or two examples of things that you've seen? What I guess I'm trying to do here is give us hope, because we talk about sort of all these other hard and fast and technical requirements and research related issues, but hope and optimism sometimes are really what drives these outcomes. So, and particularly at that storytelling level, at the local level, you can actually kind of really engage. And I have to say, when you're working on this stuff at the higher level, it is very easy to get quite despondent and think that the task is too big. And one of the things I've loved through my role with the City of Yarra is doing some of the grants review, because I get to see amazing initiatives being put forward by the community that give me hope, that show that the momentum is there at that grassroots level. There are two that I'd love to mention. One is this actually isn't City of Yarra or City of Melbourne, it's City of Darebin, but they've just recently won an award for an amazingly innovative program, which to me I love it because it touches on mitigation and adaptation. So basically, they're working with vulnerable sectors of the community, and the council basically pay to put solar panels. It's in conjunction with MEFL, the Moreland Energy Foundation, and they pay to put solar panels on the roofs of the houses of these disadvantaged communities, and then and they've worked very closely with these families to work out exactly their energy use, what size they would need, and then they add the cost of those solar panels onto the rates of that house, but they make sure that that increase in rates is well and truly offset by the decrease in bills that this improved technology does. And so, you're decreasing their energy bills, you're increasing, particularly with the elderly population, the heat stroke is a real problem. So on hot days, you're actually ensuring that they're going to be able to continue running their air conditioning without fear of the expensive bill at the end of the month. So I think this is just a really wonderful initiative that brings so much together. And the other one that it's more of a ones, and it's related to the urban forestry thing, is there's so much happening in the urban forestry community garden space. And to me, this is a really exciting area because, once again, it touches on so many different facets of climate change and broader social resilience as well, because it's people outside converting disused space into functioning space. It's about building those connections. One of my friends had a wonderful story as part of these community gardens that she had one out the front of her house that she started. She met an elderly relative who would come and help out, and because of that connection they'd made, they got into trouble one day. She ended up rushing them to hospital, and she wouldn't have even met them to have made that connection to be able to help out had this community garden not grown up. So through little stories like that, I find really great hope, and I find it really inspiring. I agree. Interestingly enough, the urban forest strategy, I have to spruik this a little bit, has just been endorsed by the World Economic Forum as an action which will now be rolled out across cities globally, and it started right here in Melbourne, which is fantastic. Well done. Don, Rowan, just one quick example of tangible action.
Yeah, I'll mention one that's a little way away from us here, but it was the support of all Australians which got it up through the federal government. And this is changes in the burning patterns of the tropical savannas in Australia. And over the last 100 years, with usual cattle grazing practices, people would set very hot fires and you'd actually be releasing a lot of greenhouse gases through that process. And what's been found, if the more traditional indigenous fire burning patterns are used in these great savannas, you actually reduce the emissions substantially. And there's been very important federal government grants because of the community support for action on climate change that are now particularly enabling Indigenous communities in the Kimberley, in the top end, Cape York and the Gulf to be implementing extensive changes to savanna burning practices. It's saving a huge amount in emissions in the tropical savannas. It's bringing income and jobs into remote Indigenous communities and giving a sense of purpose and good land management practice into these communities as well. It's a really exciting outcome, and a lovely thing is the CEO of the Kimberley Land Council has been invited over to Paris, and they'll be doing a presentation of this successful tropical savanna burning project in Paris, with a view now to be encouraging other countries to take the leadership of the Indigenous communities in Northern Australia. I think that's really exciting.
And I think too, when you talk about caring for country, that's it right there. And I think they actually won a Banksia Award a couple of years ago because I was there that night and I thought what a fantastic project. Rowan, you've got the last uplifting optimism before we fire to questions. And we perhaps get some
I think
tough
the
ones.
one that we're most excited about at the moment is actually the opportunity, at the risk of blowing air up the city of Melbourne, is the opportunity for business.
It's a renewable source.
Yeah, that's right. For the City of Melbourne and businesses like ourselves to work together, investigate the opportunities for collaboratively purchasing renewable energy here in Melbourne on scale, significantly on scale. Now, whilst we've made a commitment to purchase and become 100% renewable under the CBD commitments, being able to do that in collaboration with local government and business and the community in here in Melbourne is absolutely exciting thing to do. Can I just make one comment though? Those of you who read the Fin Review, this piece around hope is just so critically important. Don and Mr. Gore drummed that into me when we did the first round of climate change presentations around the globe, around the country. Now, hope inspires and despair just cripples people. And something like, page 43 yesterday of the Australian Fin Review, I don't know if people saw it. There's a photo there of the city of Melbourne. Did anybody see that? It was a photo of the city of Melbourne, and the comment was, central Melbourne's rooftops could potentially house 637 hectares of solar panels, a town hall study has found. The greening of all of the roofs in Melbourne. Now, if that's not inspirational, if that does not provide hope, and if that's not leadership from the City of Melbourne, I don't know what is. Congratulations.
Thanks, Rowan. Now, we'll happily take that congratulation, and I think it's an amazing project, and those projects just continue to roll out in cities right across the world. And I think if you look at the C40 network, now the Rockefeller Foundation network, Bloomberg, Rockefeller, these huge names, big brands, like you say, the momentum is starting to well and truly flow the other way, where the venture capital's going, the insurance industry is starting to talk solidly about it. And I think the role of cities is almost to show the global community what these projects physically look like at scale. So I think that's the really big role of cities. So with all that hope and optimism, we're now going to throw to the floor for our first questions. We've got plenty. So we'll start over here. Just your name and your question. We'll try and get through as many as possible. So if you can keep your questions reasonably tight, we'll try and get through as many as we can.
Okay, hi. I'm Dale O'Toole. I'm a sustainability manager for Saddles. We manage property throughout the country. I did read that article in the Fin Review about the study that the City of Melbourne are looking at, and I know that these are initiatives looked at by Sydney as well through their Better Buildings Partnership. I guess what I'm interested in hearing is understanding that there's amazing opportunity. How do you guys work with your planning controls people to ensure that owners who our company represents don't see a risk in putting in $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 worth of panels only to be blotted out by development in 5 years' time? I think that has to be part of the conversation.
Just an easy question to start with, Kathy. Councillor Kathy. I will just start very quickly because that's my portfolio. It's a great question. We called for a review about 12 months ago of exactly that, to look at solar access, and the issue is we're in a very fast-growing area, a very urbanised area. We're the fastest-growing municipality, in fact, in the country. So there's going to be some areas which, unfortunately, due to height, we're just not going to be able to go that solar route. So that's why big-scale, large-scale solar in our regional areas is going to be really important. But that being said, we are now trialling in West Melbourne a way of actually providing much more security around that solar access. So where there are mandatory height limits, where there are more stable communities, that's where we'll target the ability to keep that security. But that is an ever-evolving issue, and it's one that's presenting itself more and more. So I don't think we'll ever fully answer it, but we're going to go some way to answering that as the West Melbourne structure plan rolls out, because it's a fairly vexing question to have, on the one hand, really strong sustainability principles and to go out to the community and say, we want you to help us on this renewable energy push, and then to be grappling with that issue of a new 10 or 20-storey development going up next door. So it's a really significant issue. Kathy, do you want to?
Oh no, I just thought the key point of your question was our planning controls, and if I was in charge of our planning controls, it would be great, and I think we would move closer to having greater control over protection of solar access within the City of Melbourne, but it's not entirely ours. We have a City of Melbourne Act, but the Planning Act is actually controlled by the Planning Minister, and we have put some significant planning scheme amendments through that some have gone through and some are still sitting on desks, including around a greater increase in contribution of open space from development. That would be great if we could increase contributions from developers for green open space in our city. But I know we were asking for action at the end of this, but greater calls for the change of the planning scheme, not just within the City of Melbourne, but across the state, because I know that we're not the only municipality wanting greater protection for solar access. So that change shouldn't be done just within the City of Melbourne's Planning Act, but across the state as well. But I agree, and when we probably can, and we need to lift our advocacy and actually start developing words around that ourselves. So.
And I think the other really intelligent thing in this is, and this is where a sense of community comes in as a really important thing, is where we've got situations of either high-rises, 70% of people in the City of Melbourne live in apartments, is that's where we need to be thinking about precinct energy. So you've got a situation where you're able to locate, whether they're panels or turbines or whatever they may be, in an area where we're not going to see those sorts of impacts. That won't answer all those situations, but things like the mapping, providing good data behind it, being really logical, linking with strong research institutions. We've mapped our commercial rooftop space, and we've been very conservative, again, looking at height limits as a real issue, but we conservatively think we can put about 20 megawatts of commercial rooftop solar on. But to meet our 25% renewable energy target, we're looking at around about 1,100 or 1,200 megawatts of necessary install, and hence things like the large-scale group buy is going to be something that we need to move solidly on. But it's a great question, a tough question, and one that's definitely front of mind for us. Next question, just down the middle here.
Hi, my name is Katie Parrott. I'm a student of Geography and Politics at the University of Melbourne. This is potentially something of a devil's advocate kind of question, but I'd like to hear your answer anyway. Given that national governments, and I'm thinking of Australia here, seem to be somewhat unwilling or unable to curb carbon emissions, and I am thinking of forestry in Tasmania, mining in the NT and WA, and other environmental issues such as ocean acidification, overfishing, etc. So given we have that on one hand, and that we've had proven action made by cities or local governments, such as what you've spoken about in Melbourne, also I'm thinking of cities like Curitiba in Brazil and Copenhagen, Why do we focus so much on global agreements, and why do we assume that that's how we have to deal with these kinds of issues? I think it was Stephanie, you said the task is considered too big. Why do we make it so big?
What a great question for the topic this evening. Don, do you want to start off, and then Stephanie, you want to follow up?
It is a great question. And I suppose the point I was trying to make in my very first introductory comments were that I think two things are really important here. You do need global agreements because we all breathe the air. And we can do our best, but then if there's a group of countries that are absolutely laggards, we all cop it. But that's only half the solution because it is politically so difficult. And so I think we also, at the same time, need to be doing everything else we can do. So I think it's actually a case of you don't put all your eggs in one basket. It is really important, this agreement-making process, but it's going to be modest. It's going to have gaps. It's going to be frustrating. And it's really important we strive for excellence through all the other initiatives. It might almost be like building a sustainable house. You've got to have a foundation there. And that's perhaps all the global agreement can do, but you've got to have it. And then what you put on top of it is the excellence and the ambition, and that's where the role of cities, the divestment movement, the investment movement, all of those initiatives are just so important.
And does it get to the stage, Don, where, because I think that's a fantastic question to ask, and that answer is spot on in terms of not putting your eggs all in one basket, but does it get to the stage where the lead countries on this just, look at the global green economy and the way things are moving, does it get to the stage where, and this is my great concern for our lovely country, is you stick to the old business model and the whole world moves, and it doesn't matter whether you sign onto a global agreement or not, but you're doing yesterday's business when no one wants to buy your products anymore.
Yeah.
Are we getting to that sort of point as well? Is there that tipping point from a business sense?
Well, Rowan may be able to better answer that than me, but I think this is not just an environment debate, because what you do see now, for example, the amount of global investment flow for new energy production construction, there's much greater investment flow going into renewables than there is into fossil fuel generation. And we passed that crossover point a couple of years ago, if I'm remembering correctly. So there is a huge economic opportunity, there's an opportunity for innovation, and you could argue in Australia, I mean, we have had the world's leading research in solar in our universities. And yet we're one of the laggards, we're picking up now, but we've been one of the laggards in getting into this space, and the jobs are in other countries that are building solar panels. There's just a very clean, simple example.
Any other quick comments before we go to our next?
Move to questions.
Move to our next question. Next question is just down the front, just here.
Hi, John Knox. I'm a volunteer climate campaigner. Just a statement first off, November 27, 5:30 p.m, State Library. Be there, bring your friends. The People's Climate March. You got to be in it.
And City of Melbourne has formally endorsed it on Tuesday night.
It's going to be huge. But a question, I guess, for the panel in general. Paris is not the end, it's just the start. I believe that a turnaround of 3 years in the ambitions, the statements from countries would be far better than 5 years. 1 year would be even better again, but that might be asking a little bit much. Is there any hope of getting countries to sign on to 3 years? And if you ask them for 3 years, maybe they'll sign on to 5.
Great question. Let me answer it by this. So at the moment, Australia's supporting a 10-year cycle. We've only got a 2030 target on the table. So our first job is to change that. Now, my heart is where yours is, but we've got a job to shift Australia from 10 to 5-year cycles. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be going in there. So when we all go in to our federal members after this meeting, let's say to them, we want a 1 or a 3 year cycle. get rid of your 10-year cycle, please.
Okay, so I like that. That'll be the phone calls we're making after the show. I think we've got our next question down here.
Okay, yeah, Peter Forsyth is my name. I don't want to be too much of a wet blanket, but the municipalities represented up there are doing some good initiatives, but I think the City of Melbourne might be going more to greying rather than greening. High population growth policies of the municipalities, of the state and federal governments, there's a hell of a lot of concrete being poured in Melbourne and Yarra, and producing cement releases a hell of a lot of carbon dioxide. They consume electronics that people in those new houses and offices consume, involve a lot of non-renewable stuff, all the air travel they use. So, and you might have a green rooftop on your building, but could be 25 floors of concrete underneath. So rather than things improving, I think they're getting worse. What do you think about high population growth policies regarding our climate?
The elephant in the room. Okay.
Yes, a big elephant.
It's a really, really good question. I think it's one that sort of seems to be one that, you know, doesn't get asked often enough, or when it does get asked, there's all sorts of of comments made around it. I've got my own things. The Millennium Development Goals previously, when you do things like you start to bring down child mortality rates, when you improve contraception, when you improve women's rights, particularly in developing nations, what's shown is the growth curves actually drop by themselves. Now, they're probably not going to drop quick enough for the sorts of issues that we're facing, but I think when you start to talk about population, people start thinking about caps and all sorts of areas which are very fraught, as you've seen that's happened in China. I agree, though, population is a significant thing. It's not the only thing, though. It's a huge thing. But what we've seen over a long period of time is that there is a heck of a lot of waste in the system. So you can actually eliminate a lot of that waste, become far more sustainable, have far less impact per person. But there's absolutely no doubt that no one species on this planet can keep on growing until the ends of the earth. And in fact, you would argue that we are well and truly at the Earth's ecosystem limits at the moment. But there are ways to tackle it without sort of getting to that controversial setting of a cap, and those are certainly some of the ways that the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals are looking at tackling. Any other comments from the panel in terms of population? It's probably one of the biggest issues.
No, just that, yes, density in the City of Melbourne, is growing. And we have, on any given day, we have 800,000 people come into our city, and obviously they're not all residents. They're coming in for their jobs in other buildings, not just the ones that they're living in. And I guess it's following on from what Aaron's saying about doing things more sustainably, and I guess as in our role in the areas that we can have influence or can actually change, we are doing as much as we can, or I know there's more that we can be doing, but that we're doing a lot around making the buildings more sustainable, or creating with the urban forest strategy, making the streets greener and trying to get more green open space. But I think that, if they're not coming into the city to live, they're going into the outer suburbs, and we are losing. And again, if it wasn't the Fin Review article about the green roofs, it'd be the Fin Review article about the loss of grasslands. And not that far out from the city, we're losing significant ecosystems, significant biodiversity through further growth in our green wedges. And it does also become that balance between housing people in the city, near the jobs, more sustainably as much as we can, or further building on ecosystems that we can't lose any more of.
Any further comments? It's a tough one, Rowan.
It is. Perhaps look, in terms of you called the population issue the elephant of the room. I guess my hope would be that we can adopt the maturity to have the conversation rather than be the elephant in the room. In terms of the growth in Melbourne, I spent a lot of time in Europe. Italy and France. I'm always impressed that France is such a decentralised country. I think it's 11 cities with populations in the vicinity of 300,000 to 400,000 spread across the country, great infrastructure. This is not a Melbourne issue, but perhaps a Victorian issue when we've got cities like Bendigo and Ballarat and Latrobe and Geelong which provide good infrastructure and the opportunities for population growth, I'm not quite sure why the concentration needs to be so much on Melbourne. Yeah, no, in terms of geography, it couldn't be better designed, Victoria, for a decentralised economy. Yeah.
Great question. Our next question is just down the front here.
Fantastic lead up. My name is Erwin Boermans. To stop the local brain drain, and Aaron is also one of those. I'm one of those that was pulled to Melbourne by various reasons. We need to stop that local brain drain in the small remote towns, and we need to create the heroes to go back. And those heroes can be educated, but need the platform and need the network here in Melbourne to fall back on. Can we create that? We have a clean tech network. Doesn't really work. We need an academic real platform, and we need the investors on board. We need everybody on board that networking really works, that Aaron can bring the local people from Mildura that are desperately in need for well-informed people that lead to come back to those sessions here in Melbourne to learn and to make their local systems work. Because it's not only electrons, it's well-informed people that actually make it happen. And it is district heating, it is wind farms, it's hybrid solutions. And so I'd like to ask the panel, how can we create that platform?
So I'm picking up two things there. The networks that actually allow good research, good collaboration, but then also I think there's a question around the role that regions, rural and regional Australia potentially can play as we meet this challenge. Who wants to kick off with that?
Cities are not just Melbourne and Sydney. We've got, there's municipalities across the country. So I guess that my response would be, the role that we celebrate being a knowledge city, and maybe I'm not entirely sure if I'm answering your question, but in terms of, celebrating the knowledge sector within our municipality, and maybe, there's a role of, and there are great regional towns with great universities as well that do that. So, and maybe the network is around the groups like Missy.
But also, I even think that the significant role you play with ICLEI, and obviously Melbourne is a member of ICLEI, but what role does a network like ICLEI play, I guess, in, you're going to play a huge role in terms of negotiations, but what role does that play in terms of an ongoing learning environment?
Yes, but again, at the city level, obviously we're all networked and like this. We share capacity and share capability across municipal governments around, what we're doing in this space. So there's sharing of knowledge between cities, but in terms of working, I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm still struggling to get the point.
You can take the question on notice as a politician, and you can continue to answer other sorts of questions.
I'm not sure how to answer it. Sorry, Erwin.
I think one of the key things that we can do as a society is we know that we're going to have to undergo some reasonably significant transitions in the next little while. And what we can do is ensure that those regional communities are, those sort of regional and vulnerable communities, we can focus on them to benefit from those transitions as they occur. And a lot of those regional communities are in good positions to really capitalise on the transition to a sort of low carbon economy, I would argue. So I think it's about being really, really conscious and managing that transition in a way that allows those communities to benefit. So. And
then I'd just add the 2 cents in terms of, having grown up in a regional town, that many of these, the regional and rural towns are already facing the absolute impacts of climate change. We went through a 14-year drought in Mildura, and they set aside $2 million in the rural counselling budget for farmers to access some advice if they were struggling a little bit, and they thought that would last for 6 months, and it was gone within a month. The rates of suicide exploded. So I think your question is a really valid one, because I think sometimes as very prosperous cities like we are in Melbourne, that we can be a little insulated from what's going on out there in some of those rural and regional communities. And as a leader, as a capital city leader, I think that's where our role is really significant across all the sectors.
I'll give you an example, an opportunity that does exist. We have about $800 million worth of assets in the Latrobe Valley. And here we are, a bank with a strong sense of commitment towards sustainability. The way that we've looked at a regional community like the Latrobe Valley is that they will need a diversity of skills in order to ensure that that's remains a strong local economy, and has a business like ours with $700–800 million worth of assets, a vested interest in ensuring that there is a diversity of industries in that community. Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think government has a role to play, but industry with vested interest has a role to play as well.
We've got time for one last question over here.
Don Hampshire, just an ordinary old bloke. I'm not in favour of decarbonising the atmosphere, especially not decarbonising by 2050, which was one of the panellists' suggestion. And I misunderstood action, so my question is irrelevant, but I'm going to ask it. What is the personal opinion of each of the panellists to nuclear energy?
Yeah, what a great question. Excellent question. Kathy, we'll start with you. The question was the opinion on nuclear energy. Well, so we've had some very, very good questions tonight.
I think that there's too much of a risk with nuclear energy, and so personally, and obviously as a Greens councillor as well, I don't support the focus or the use of nuclear as part of the decarbonisation of our electricity system.
Stephanie?
There's been some really interesting shifts in the environmental community about the attitude towards nuclear energy. I talk about people like George Monbiot, if any of you know of him, who's a very esteemed environmental thinker. And quite recently he changed his opinion on nuclear and decided he actually was in favour of it and is now strongly advocating for it. And his sort of arguments in this space were along the lines of, the deaths are overstated. If you go into the area around Chernobyl now, you actually find really thriving ecosystems, and there's not that sort of concern. So the fact that thinkers like that are now starting to shift their view, and I went to a talk by someone from the UK the other day who was talking about a new wave of nuclear technology that actually involved sort of modular nuclear plants. So you didn't have kind of this one massive time bomb. You rather had these little ones you could roll out much faster, much easier. You could pull offline again much more easily. And there was apparently great improvements in the reprocessing. And then on the other hand, in sort of the research that I've done, we're also, when we start talking about nuclear as a zero emissions option, we're not factoring in the mining of it, and we're not factoring in what you have to do to look after the waste afterwards, which is an incredible investment, not only in terms of the infrastructure, the carbon, all that sort of stuff is a massive, massive amount. And I've got some friends who've done some calculations on it, and just back of the envelope stuff, and the numbers are comparable to coal-fired power stations, quite dirty ones. So it's a really complex issue. It's a really, really complex issue. I am very curious to see where this new technology goes. I think it sounds like some of that is really promising. So for me, I don't know I think it's a very nuanced issue. But there's certainly some very interesting ideas out there in the space.
Don?
I'm respectful of different views. I've got a strong personal view that nuclear is not the answer, and I agree. I've had the opportunity to be up to Kakadu, have a really close look at the mining, the accidents, to have a look at the waste ponds that are going to be radioactive and need to be managed for 10,000 years. I've been on the ground with Chernobyl. There are very, very serious challenges with nuclear. So I then sit back and I ask the question, well, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to deliver baseload electric power with certainty and security and good price. And I think part of the other answer in there is renewables are really knocking on that door now. So we may not have to go into that space with those risks. Now, I've got strong personal views. I'm respectful of different views there, but I think the alternatives are either there or pretty close to there at the moment.
Rowan?
I think, Don, you hit the nail on the head. We may not have to go there. With advances in baseload solar, the advances in wind, the advances. I believe we're about to commission a pilot wave generation in Victoria very shortly, maybe in the next few days. Is that right? I think there are enough options for us not to go there.
So, as a moderator, I know I'm not supposed to offer comment, but I think it's such a great question, and I too, I'm with Don on respecting alternative viewpoints, but I wholeheartedly support his direction in that I can't remember, I'm very bad with stats, but we have enough sunlight that falls on the Earth each day or week to power the Earth for an entire year. Australia has the most solar resource in the developed world, if not indeed one of the highest solar resources in the world. And when you look at things like thin film solar technology, you look at battery storage, you look at also attacking the energy demand side of things. The best investment you can make is on energy efficiency. I just think this is one of those things where the cost of nuclear is actually hugely significant. And when you look at using nuclear to have Australia sort of go, low emissions, the investment that would have to be made in bringing new reactors online, both would be a huge amount of time. I think it's something in the order of 10 to 20 and then 30 years to realise the full potential. Beyond Zero Emissions did a wonderful research project on going 100% renewable for Australia using solar thermal and other solar technologies, and they looked at bringing that line online in 10 years, and they even costed it. I think it was in the order of $350 billion, so about $35 billion a year. And everyone said, wow, that's a big number. But when you look at the need to retire a lot of our coal-fired plants because they're coming to the end of their use, this equation starts to look pretty doable. And when you talk about hope and inspiration, wouldn't it be great if a Prime Minister of ours said, you know what, in 10 years' time, we're going to be 100% powered by the sun? I just think that would be amazing. So I definitely want to leave the last word to our panellists. I just want to quickly go along before we wrap up. And it's one hope or doesn't have to be about Paris. It can be just one hope that you hope to see in the very short term. Kathy?
I was quite inspired by your ending statement. I thought we should just end with you, actually. My hope was that we had a sold-out event tonight, that enough people are interested still. We hear too often that people are not interested in climate change anymore, but I think that the tide is turning back again to interest, action, and the hope is there. And I've been very inspired by our panel tonight in going to Paris, I think, on a range of areas that I hadn't, I guess, focused on before tonight. So I'm hopeful as a result of tonight too.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I think it sort of goes back to some of the comments I've made previously about, and links into that, about the seeing all these. I think the environmental movement and people who are passionate about change, whether they want to identify as an environmentalist or not, are getting more sophisticated and more targeted as everyone tries to push for action on climate change. And I think mobilising around the COP, mobilising around the divestment movements, all these things show the sign of a movement who are sort of learning how to really tap into to people's concerns, get them focused, get action happening on the ground, and sort of changing the moral licence of a lot of organisations that they've sort of taken for granted to operate. And I'm really, really excited about some of the stuff that's happening in that space.
Don?
Great time to be alive. We've got the opportunity to make a difference on this.
I like it.
Just go do it.
Very nice. Very nice. Rowan?
I hope over the next 10 months or so that Malcolm Turnbull builds sufficient political capital to be able to strongly win the next election and change the national conversation that's taking place in this country and lead a renewable energy industry and mature response to climate change in this country over the next decade.
So on that note, it's an absolute privilege to be with a panel of this calibre, but it's also a privilege to have you, the audience, sit here and be part of this event. As Kathy said, to have people still so interested and engaged in this topic when it's been going on for such a long time, gives a lot of a sense of hope and optimism for the people involved in it. I'll finish up this Melbourne conversation with a quote, and it's a little bit about sort of the overwhelming sense of trying to reach a global agreement. But no one of us can do everything for the environment, but we can all do something, and that's why personal action is so, so important. So thank you very much for listening tonight.